This is the first video in a 4-part series going over how to set up hardware with SoundCheck. In this video, we'll concentrate on setting up Listen brand hardware. First, what is the system hardware? This is a table in SoundCheck that allows you to configure all your devices that will input or output from SoundCheck. These are global settings. Once you have them set up the first time, you won't need to change them between sequences. Once the hardware channels are assigned, you'll need to go to System Calibration to assign them to signal paths. We'll go over that in a later video series. Here are some examples of hardware that can be used with SoundCheck. In addition to this, if it's recognized by Windows or Mac OS, it can be used with SoundCheck. However, Listen has validated some specific audio interfaces for use with SoundCheck. A list of these can be found at support.listeninc.com under User Documentation in the Hardware Compatibility list. So now, let's walk through a specific scenario. Say I've just purchased SoundCheck 14 and an Amp Connect. I've installed SoundCheck 14 on Windows 7 and I have my Amp Connect plugged in. How do I get the Amp Connect to communicate with SoundCheck and to actually pass the signal where I want it to go? Before we even open up SoundCheck, we'll need to make a few changes in Windows first. Any device that's using a WDM driver goes through Windows Mixer before it gets into SoundCheck. The settings we need to adjust can be found by clicking Start, Control Panel, Sound. This brings up a list of all playback and recording devices that Windows can detect. Because Amp Connect is using a WDM driver, it'll appear here. Here it shows up as line Amp Connect USB. So here in the Playback tab, we'll double-click on the Amp Connect. This will open up a new window with the properties of the device. We want to click on the Levels tab and make sure the level is set to 100 and that it's actually enabled. Once this is set, we'll go do the same thing in the Recording tab. If we don't make sure that these levels are set to 100, they will actually attenuate the signals going into and out of your audio interface, which can affect your measurements. While we're in this menu, we have to do one additional thing on the Playback tab. We have to change the Windows default device to anything except our audio interface in use. The default device is what Windows plays system sounds through, so we can run into an issue if there's an amplifier in the output path, where it will amplify a Windows system sound and potentially damage our output speaker. We finished up everything we need to do in Windows, so let's go open SoundCheck. Once SoundCheck is open, we'll need to open up the system hardware table. Up top, click on Setup, Hardware. Once this is open, you'll notice 3 tabs along the top. The first is Audio, which will tie the physical hardware channel to the user-defined settings. These settings would include your bit depth, your sample rate, or your physical hardware inputs that you're actually plugging into on your audio interface. The second tab is Listen Hardware. SoundCheck will automatically detect Listen hardware that it can communicate with, and will populate this list. The third tab is External, so this is where you'd go to set up any digital I/Os or external devices. For example, an RS-232 turntable or a foot switch used to start SoundCheck would be configured in the External tab. Let's go back to the Listen Hardware tab. There are 5 devices that automatically are detected and populate into here: Amp Connect ISC, Audio Connect, Sound Connect 2, DC Connect, and BTC 4148. The first column is Device ID. When you first plug a Listen device into your computer and open SoundCheck, it will automatically populate and assign a number to your device. Here you can see I have AC1, which was plugged in first, and then AC2, which I plugged in afterwards. If I plug in an additional Amp Connect, it will increase by 1, so AC3, AC4. The device ID is what's used in SoundCheck message steps when deciding which device you're using. So in the message step, the dropdown would say AC1 or AC2, and that's where you'd select it. The second column is serial number. SoundCheck reads this off of the device, so it can't manually be changed. So if you're using multiple Amp Connects, this would be the place where you could go and reference them to the physical device that you have plugged in. The third column is Startup Default. If it's set to yes, every time you open up SoundCheck, it'll send out a message to the device and configure it in the same exact way. Status just shows if the device is connected or disconnected. As you can see here, AC1 at the top of the table is currently disconnected. The last column is simply reading the firmware off of the connected device. There are also some right-click options in this menu. So the first AM Connect, AC1, is disconnected. I don't want to see it in this menu anymore, so I can choose it, right-click it, and then select Delete. Another right-click option is to rename. So I'll right-click AC2, select the rename option, then I'll change this to R&D AM Connect. This is used to make the naming more meaningful than just having something like AC1 or AC2. So let's take a closer look at Startup Default now. When you first change it to Yes, a new window will pop up. This new window has all the settings that are on the front of an AM Connect. Anything that's selectable there, we can change here from this message step. We can also click Read Settings, which shows what we currently have in use. Let's say that I know every time I open SoundCheck for the next couple of weeks, I'll be using it to run the same exact test with the same exact inputs and outputs. This would be a great time to actually set a startup default. So I'll go through and I'll just change some of these settings to the way that I want them. I'll click Apply and OK. Every time that SoundCheck is opened for the first time, these settings are then sent to the AM Connect and will be configured in that way. When you've already set a startup default, instead of clicking Yes again, to change it, we just right-click and assign startup default. This opens up the same exact window we previously looked at, and you do the settings the same exact way. That Listen Hardware tab now takes care of the device ID and all of the reference and DUT inputs and outputs on the device itself. We still need to go over to the Audio tab to map these to input and output channels within SoundCheck. But because we're using an AM Connect, we don't actually have to go in and manually add all these channels. Instead, we just have to select Auto Mode. When selected, it gives you a warning that it will overwrite all input and output devices that you already have. We don't have any, so we're not going to worry about that and just click OK. There's input 1, input 2, output 1, output 2. These are read right off the AM Connect, and the calibrated VP values are read directly off the device, so they're set automatically for you. One thing to note about Auto Mode, however, is that it does actually lock you out from making any adjustments. So if I wanted to change the sample rate on a Listen device that supports multiple sample rates, or if I wanted to use another third-party interface alongside an AM Connect, I'd have to take it out of Auto Mode and then make those adjustments. If you ever need to do this, the best practice is to enable Auto Mode at first, let it read the settings off the device and auto-populate all the VP values, and then take it out of Auto Mode afterwards. When it goes out of Auto Mode, it doesn't remove any of the data, it doesn't change anything, but then you can go in and manually make your adjustments as needed. Your AM Connect is now configured. In the next video, we'll go over how to set up a third-party audio interface.